Good evening. Today is September 30th, 1984, and we are here at the Museum of Man in Ottawa, Canada. I'm Norman Markel from the University of Florida Department of Anthropology. The Wenner-Gren Foundation and the University of Florida's Department of Anthropology are producing a series of videotapes on the history of anthropology for the use of students and researchers in the field. We are extremely fortunate this evening to have with us Professor Frederica de Laguna, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Bryn Mawr College. Also a member of the National Academy of Sciences and past president of the American Anthropological Association. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you tonight, and we'd like to start asking you how you got started in the field of anthropology. That might be a good place to start.
Well, I think it was my father's inspiration. He was a philosopher and taught at Bryn Mawr College, but between the time when he graduated from Berkeley and before he went to Cornell, where he met my mother, he was one of the very first school teachers to go to the Philippines after the insurrection. That was a volunteer group, and he found that experience so very interesting that it remained one of the highlights of his life. He, when he was there, he was in the village of Cagayan on the island of Mindanao. The natives, the educated ones, could speak some Spanish, but no one could speak English. And he became interested in writing a text for future school teachers who would be using Visayan. He never finished that grammar, but I gave the manuscript to Bryn Mawr College Library. So I was a student at Bryn Mawr College, even though both of my parents were then actively teaching philosophy. It was partly because I was very young for my age, very naive, and my parents had wanted to send me to Cornell, but on thinking things over, they thought perhaps staying closer to home would be better.
They could keep an eye on you.
Yep, but I myself wanted to go to Bryn Mawr. It had a reputation, and I was interested in that. Although I early learned to play a dual role among my fellow students as another student, at home on faculty row as a faculty child, and attempted to keep these two parts of me quite separate. And indeed, there was never any gossip that I transmitted from one area to the other. Well, I was very much interested in all aspects of social science, such as it was then, and also in history. And it never occurred to me or to my parents that I would not go on to graduate work. So the question was in what field. And my father, remembering the tremendous impression that his experiences in the Philippines and later for a month or so in Japan, wandering around, had made on him, he thought that anthropology would suit me. And he and my mother had heard Boas speak. And if he had spoken at Bryn Mawr, I didn't hear him. So I don't know where it was. So it was suggested then that I go to Columbia because that was the place. They felt that anthropology was the growing discipline and enter Columbia. So I went to Columbia and had a talk, of course, with Dr. Franz Boas. He told me that it would be very difficult to earn a living in anthropology. He warned me, and I said, I don't care, this is what I want to try and want to do. So I entered the following year, That was the fall of 1927. It took me the full first semester to discover what anthropology was not about before I began to realize what it was about the second semester. But my expectations of what it was about were really programmatic. It should be something that would embrace all, give meaning to all of the of our understanding of human beings in one way or another, and also our interests in each other. And it was some years later that I found that anthropology was doing that for me. It was the what Tyler called the great pack frame, which enabled students of all different disciplines to put them together and carry them more easily. So I was never disappointed. Well, I had received the European Fellowship at the time of my graduation from Bryn Mawr, and was given permission to use it, not the next year, but after 1 year at Columbia. So I went abroad the first summer with an archaeological school, a school of prehistory under George Grant McCurdy of Yale. We went to, among other places, southern France, and dug for a while in the Dordogne. And then later, in the winter, I was worked on my own up to Christmas time in Paris. Now, before I went, Dr. Boas had suggested to me that since I was going abroad, that I might investigate the possible relationship between Upper Paleolithic and Eskimo art, since it had been claimed, beginning with Boyd Dawkins, an Englishman who excavated in southern France, that the Eskimos were the inheritors of the Upper Paleolithic. In fact, some people, like Professor Solis of England, he was alive at that time, and I met him, a charming gentleman, believed that the Eskimo were actually the descendants of Cro-Magnon man. This was because the skull of Chancelade, which was one of these big-headed, rugged Cro-Magnon types, had a, a scaphoid-shaped skull like that, which was typical of the Greenland Eskimos. And Solis believed that that was an actual, you might say, Eskimo or Eskimo ancestor. Turned out later that the nasal bones had been broken off and lost at the time that most of the casts and photographs were made, and therefore made the skull look much more Eskimo than when the gentleman still had his hawk-like beak found. So when I was in Paris, I was attending free lectures at the Institut de Paléontologie Humaine given by the Abbé Breuil, who incidentally taught me how to make black and white pen and ink drawings of specimens. And then part of the time I was on my own out at the Musée National de Préhistoire, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, I think was the place. I was within easy commuting distance of Paris. I'd go out there and take a lunch and work drawing pictures of specimens. Well, what happened was I went to England, had 1 quarter at the London School, taking a course with Malinowski, and then went to Scandinavia to see the Eskimo material, because the finest collection, in fact, of Eskimo archaeological material, which of course is what I had to look at, not modern material, was in Copenhagen. And when I was there, I was given the opportunity, just out of the blue, of accompanying Mathiasen, the father of Eskimo archaeology, to Greenland as his assistant when he was beginning his very first archaeological work in Greenland. And this was an opportunity which meant a real turning point in my life. And although I'd been interested in anthropology before, this was all-absorbing. I gave up everything else then for this. We were gone 6 months. I was supposed to have returned at the end of 3, but I couldn't tear myself away. Incidentally, if you're interested, I kept all of my letters back to my parents and theirs to me while I was in Greenland. And out of these, I made a book which was not published until after I retired because it was such a personal document. And Norton published it in 1975, Voyage to Greenland, a personal introduction to anthropology. And the only things that I added to this, I didn't change, I cut some passages, but I didn't change what I had written in the summer of 1929. There was an introduction that I wrote in 1930 after my return, explaining what I thought it was going to be like, and we might say what it was, and then finally a preface in 1975 and an epilogue in 75. But the inside is this, this young woman writing.
Well,
so,
when you read it in 75 and looked back at that young woman writing, what were your thoughts?
I wished I were back there again with her.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good experience.
Wonderful experience.
And you feel that the work you did was good work? I mean, that...
Yes. Well, Mathiasen was the foremost archaeologist of his day. Now, since then, what's his name? The book was reviewed, and very interestingly reviewed, by I'm sorry to say, I cannot remember his name. I believe he's a Scandinavian, or if not, of Scandinavian ancestry. He's a Canadian, and it was reviewed for a Canadian journal, and he was seemed to me the only one who really understood what it was all about. What was I going to say about it? Well, anyway, it was definitely, for me, a worthwhile experience. And I always wanted to go back to Greenland. So, 50 years later, after I retired, and after my mother had died, after the death of my father in 1930, we lived together, and when she lived for a long, long time after her retirement. And at the very end, she was practically blind. She lived until she was 99 and a half. So the last few years, I was not able to go away from home very much because someone had to be there with her, of course. But I took the money that I'd saved and some that did come from her, and I went back to the very same area of Greenland, northwest Greenland, Upernavik district, where I'd been before, taking with me enlargements of the photographs I'd had then. And it was only one person that I had known who was still alive, and that was a man who had been a small boy when we were excavating and had been there on the island with us. And he was now one of the senior hunters of the place.
Is that right?
Oh, that was
nice.
a wonderful experience.
Well, Professor
But-
de Laguna, when
yes.
excuse me, when you look back on that, do you feel that experience in archaeology, what was the relation between that and your later field work in non-archaeological areas? Did that help you? Was it just a separate experience?
No, it wasn't at all. It absolutely convinced me, if I hadn't been convinced before, that the field work should be, if possible, done by, one should employ as many approaches to a people as possible if one is to understand them, and one of the important ones is archaeology. And the archaeology shows you, if you're fortunate, the beginnings of the patterns, which you then can see later in the ethnographic present. In the same way, if you may be looking back in time, as I had to do in Alaska, where cultures had changed more than they had in Greenland, or a good many of them had. And there, when the old people were talking about the ways of their grandfathers, you see, they could often interpret what you had found, or even their misinterpretations were enlightening. And then, of course, the use of historical documents, insofar as they're available, and of museum collections. And I never felt that the anthropologist should be too divided. Now, it's perfectly true that I realize that most of us are rather naive from the point of view of an historian in our utilization of historical materials. But on the other hand, the historians, so many of them, who attempt to attack problems that we would regard as anthropological, seem to be quite naive in their handling. So we've got a great deal to learn from each other in techniques and in things to look for.
In addition to archaeology, I do know that you have done linguistic field work. The trip to Greenland trained you in archaeology. How did you get trained in linguistics?
Well, now, the first linguistics that I was doing was in Greenland, and it was curious that after 50 years, some of the Greenland words which I had learned came back to me. They're surrounded by Eskimos. Incidentally, I'd had to learn Danish in order to make that trip, and so for 2-3 years in advance, I had been studying away at Danish in the hope that that's where I'd go. And then I took a advanced course with Berlitz in Copenhagen for about 3 weeks before I went to Denmark. Well, now, the linguistics that I did, I think it was Boas's influence. One might be the only, most of us starting out in the 30s, might be the only anthropologist to work among a given people, or might come along long after some great predecessor. And we were supposed then to gather as much information as we could in as many ways as possible. Well, now, obviously, a linguistic approach was highly desirable. I knew that I was never a linguist and that my work was always amateurish. I tried to record place names. Obviously, the archaeologist should know that. Personal names, vocabulary. And I'm sorry to say, most of the vocabulary, of course, had to be nouns. I suppose that's the easiest. The noun dictionary. And then later on, faute de mieux, when Birgit Smith of the National Museum of Denmark, an ethnologist primarily, and I were collaborating on a joint Danish-American expedition to Prince William Sound. We utilized our combined efforts and skills to study the Eyak, and we were with this little group still living at Cordova on the edge of Prince William Sound. We were with them while the ground was still frozen. And then finally, when the ground thawed, we went out to one of the sites which I had earlier located. This was in 1933 that we were there. And we had with us for a good month one of the old Chugach natives, Chief McCarka, and we had his daughter, Ma Tiedemann. Matrona was her given name, but everybody called her Ma, as interpreter. So we took turns devoting ourselves to doing the digging or doing ethnographic work with the Tiedemanns. And every night after dinner, when the dishes were cleared off the table, the old man would begin to tell stories, and his daughter would translate them. So we were doing the best we could, you see, to record as much as possible. Now, we didn't attempt to record the stories themselves in Chugach, but there were a number of songs, the words for songs that were given, or shorter pieces, which we tried writing. So
that's interesting. You didn't at that time. Were there recording devices for?
No, there weren't.
That you could
alas, no.
There was not.
No.
Let me ask you. Around that time, we're talking about your being a student of Boas in the very late 20s, early 30s.
Yes.
Area. What was it like to be a student of Boas at that time? Your fellow students and your relationships with Boas, Boas's relation with students, who were the other people that were there at that time?
Yes. Well, it seemed to me there was a great deal of coming and going in the department. It occupied a very small section of Skirmerhorn Hall. As I recall, it was on the ground floor as you entered in one direction, but several stories high above the other direction. And let's see, the psychology department was above us. And on one occasion, there was some kind of leak in a tank that the psychologists had with their frogs, and they got loose in Skirmerhorn. I don't know if they invaded us, but we went through some swinging doors, and then we were in anthropological territory.
Did that later affect any ties between anthropology and psychology? Or
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Now, let's see, Otto Kleinberg was in psychology. Yeah, and he was around all the time. Now, this shows just how naive I was. He had a nice pencil.
Otto Kleinberg did?
Otto Kleinberg, yeah. Metal, it was one of these Propel pencils with lead, and it had something written around it. And I asked him, I said, what is that? And he said, it's Hebrew. I said, can you read it? He looked at me. Of course he could read it. I didn't know. I was completely oblivious to who might be Jewish or who wasn't, in the same way that I attending a boarding school in France, and there were two sisters from Martinique. I was completely oblivious to the fact that they were part Negro. They were just fellow classmates. But there was a young woman, I guess she was older than I was. We shared an office together. I don't suppose it was my first year, but I can't really remember. Well, she began talking about so many Jews around. She didn't like it. Well,
this was a woman in anthropology.
Yeah. Her name was Han. I don't know what happened to her. Well, in the office with us was, let's see, Nez Perce. The name was just gone. He was a young Nez Perce Indian, and he had collected Nez Perce mythology, Archie Finney. And those were wonderful stories. Wonderful stories. Excellently translated. I would suppose excellently translated, but anyway, he would tell us some of them or read some of them. And it was very enlightening to me to discover that each animal in the stories had his own way of speaking, or his own way of speaking, I think you should say, with one of the animals stuttering and another nasal and so forth and so on. And he also he smoked kinnikinick, which was sent to him by his mother on the reservation, and I enjoyed the smell of that very much. Well, now those are the two that I remember as sharing an office. Another was May Mandelbaum. I had a course in linguistics with Boas, but it was an unstructured course. What he was trying to show us was how we would go about studying a language in the field when you're starting in cold. He had with him that marvelous Dakota woman, Ella Deloria. Vine Deloria called her Aunt Ella. She was an indestructible woman, really. She told us that when she went back to the reservation, she made a point of sleeping on the floor because, on the board floor, because sleeping in a soft bed had made her round-shouldered. And so Boas was, first he was eliciting the various sounds. La jota, and so on. Oh yes, really rolling that back X. Then he got on to a certain amount, this was done through vocabulary, you see. Then he got on to certain verb forms and went through a paradigm of I do this, and you do that, you singular do that, and he does that, and we, so forth. And could see a certain regularity. So then he began experimenting with the new verb. She burst out laughing. She said, that's baby talk. You see, it was an irregular verb.
Yes.
And but as I say, it was unstructured.
That's very similar to Professor Haas telling us how she discovered male and female speech in Louisiana, that she was giving back something to an informant and said, there's something wrong with that, and he said, you can't say that because you're a woman.
Yes, yeah. Well, then for a semester, we were given a Yoruba informant to use for speech. He was studying for an MA in economics. The myth was that he had been a royal drummer, but had found the strain too great, because if a royal drummer made a mistake, it was off with his head. Or in any case, he was a very patient man. So there we would be going, quake, 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 or rather beginning much lower down, because his was a good bass voice. But May Mandelbaum and I would disagree violently on how certain things were to be written down, and we'd have him go over and over and over again, and there was nobody in that class to really judge between us. Now, who else was a student? Oh, yes, Ruth Underhill. Now, I can't remember whether she was a student there at the same time I was. I think she must have been. Yes, indeed. Then I got to know her much better out on the reservation when we, sometime later, when we were both working for the Soil Conservation Service. And then there was Mel Jacobs, as we were talking about. And he was just finished up, or was just finishing up that first year at Columbia. Mm-hmm. And he had a job, which was, it was something. But anyway, he apparently had never been west of the Palisades, except to visit Boas's house at Edgewood. He used to go across on the 125th Street ferry. And let me come back to the ferry in a moment. Okay. But anyway, he was feeling so badly about having to go west, away from in the uncivilized world. And I tried to cheer him up. I said, but there'll be all those Indians there, and it's not so uncivilized. But think of all the wonderful linguistic work he'll be able to do, which of course he was able to do. And a few years later, in 1930, I was on my way west for my first independent field trip, which was to explore sites in Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet. My brother, then a student at Haverford College, accompanying me as roustabout, boatman, extra shovel, and so on. Well, now the 125th Street.
125th Street Ferry.
Yep. In crossing, the ice used to come down the river and bump against the ferry boat. And Boas used to invite his students every so often to his house, and we'd go over. And he was apt to wax nostalgic about the Arctic. And ever since I had been a child, I had wanted to go to the Arctic. The Eskimos had seemed to me the most exciting people in the world, especially since my father had filled me full of what he'd read about Stefansson and his notions of living like an Eskimo. And then I had read Elisha Kent Kane's works, particularly the second Grinnell expedition, when he discovered the polar Eskimos. And he and his boat, his ship's company were the only other people in the world that they'd seen. And here, the Eskimos were living fat and happy, and Kane's men were dying of scurvy and other forms of malnutrition. And Kane himself was a medical doctor. Well, you know, that was a real challenge. So when I had a chance to go to Greenland, I was convinced from the beginning that it was going to be the most wonderful experience in my life, that it was going to be an adventure, and that I was going to enjoy all of it. And I did, including all the strange food, everything.
Great. I think we take a break for a few minutes.
Certainly.
Well, Professor De Laguna, we were talking before we took our break about your graduate school days, and one of the things you remembered was the 125th Street Ferry. Did you want to say a few more words about that?
Yes, I did. Well, it made Boas reminisce about his first field trip to the Arctic when the ice came bumping. And one of the stories he told was about traveling. As you know, he did a tremendous amount of travel by dog sled, sometimes quite alone. He had a keg of molasses, he said, and he used to put some molasses in a pitcher and take along with him on a trip, and he would hang the pitcher on the upstanders of his sled. And this was among the few European foods that he'd have on these trips. He cherished that molasses. Then when he got to the bottom of the barrel, he said he found a dead rat in there. But I think really that the fact that I was going to go abroad, that I was interested in the Eskimos, and that Mathiesen had only recently published his Archaeology of the Central Eskimos, a groundbreaking book. That was in 1927 it came out, made Boas suggests to me this topic of the possible relationship between the Upper Paleolithic men and the Eskimo. And I should say that I did not come out with any definite conclusion for or against, although people have quoted me as taking one position or the other. All I could decide was that Eskimo art gave the appearance of being a very old art, whereas the Upper Paleolithic art seemed to be a very new, young art, and that there was so much distance of time and space between the two. How could one tell, you see, whether there was enough similarity to count?
I see. Before we get too far away
Yes.
from the rat at the bottom of the barrel, can you match that with an unpleasant field experience of your own?
Of that?
Well, it doesn't have to be quite as gross. Or
No, well, not as illuminating as that. Well, on this field trip with Mathiasen, we were camped on a very small island, Inuksuk, and we had a family of Eskimo with us, who came with us from Upernavik village, with an extra Eskimo, unattached young man, Robert. We had our two tents were pitched at the very edge of the midden, facing on the rocks, facing the water. And there was very little shelter on the island, and I had my place for a privy, you might say, around the beach in this direction. And when we first came to the island, there was a lot of ice attached to the shore. We brought with us 100 auks, and they were put into a cache dug into the ice. Well, the ice was melting, and I was around relieving myself, and Mathiasen had told Robert to go and move the auks because the ice was about to collapse and put them somewhere else. So first thing I knew, just about 6 feet above me, was Robert working away on these auks, and I was really upset and miffed. So I told Mathiasen, I thought that was really going some. He said, "Oh, nonsense." Didn't mean a thing to him. That's just the way they are. You're just being prudish. So that was a good lesson.
Right.
Good lesson.
The time that you're talking about leads me to ask the question about, was Margaret Mead a student at that time, or had she already finished?
No, she'd already finished, you see.
When you were there.
Yeah, and she may have been at the American Museum for part of the time, but she was away in the field, and she was in Dobu, but I don't remember her return as well as I remember Ray Fortune's return from Dobu.
Oh, yeah.
And like any of the anthropologists passing through New York, particularly if they'd come back from the field, Boas would get them to speak at this seminar, he called it, met for 2 hours, sometimes longer, once a week. And everybody had to take part. Students had to report in seminar, and other people did so voluntarily. Of course, the more advanced students could report on their field work, but the rest of us would be given a book to read. I was given Huntington's theories about climate and civilization to report on. That was fun. For me anyway, if not for the others. Well, so here was Ray Fortune, fresh from Dobu, and he had us electrified. He described the sorcerers of Dobu, and particularly the spells that they would put on things to on their property, for example, which would, since only they would know how to remove the spell, nobody would dare come near and touch their things. And he acted out the spell. And as I recall, one of the ones he did was, "O hornbill, dweller in the Siga Siga," and then he would wet his lips. Presumably the sorcerer had been chewing ginger to make his saliva hot and the spell more potent, and spit right out the thing. Then the hornbill was symbolized as a disease, which is going to, this horrible wasting disease, which is going to attack the person that comes in contact with it. So then the sorcerer would act out the wasting away of the victim, attacked by the disease, and finally he falls shrieking to the ground, and he ran through himself on the floor and rolled around. Oh my, that was exciting.
That is,
yeah.
Do you recommend that in Philadelphia, how one can protect their belongings, or?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a little dangerous to apply. You know, when Ray Fortune applied it to his possessions, before he was, when he was going to go away and leave his hut for a while, all the people in the neighborhood cleared out. It's a good way of losing your informants.
Right.
So don't overdo.
Professor de Laguna, I'd like to move into perhaps a different area. In terms of the overall field, in your position as a president of the American Anthropological Association, and being a student of Boas, it would probably be very interesting for students to hear, in terms of what you think you see as where the field is today, where it's come from, changes you think are important, changes you think are not important from that perspective. Could you speak to that?
Yes. I think at dinner we were talking about combined approach, were we not? Or was it? Or no, it was here. Yes. You see, we were made to feel we were jack of all trades.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the one quadrant discipline, as we call it now, in which I was given really no formal training, was physical anthropology, which is curious because everybody else that apparently that writes about the work they'd done under Boas always mentions that he had two courses which were the foundations of his program. I took neither. One was statistics, which would have done me some good, and the other was physical anthropology. What I learned about physical anthropology was from Perry, Children of the Sun Perry, in London, no thanks to Malinowski, who was really horrid to me since he hated Boas and he was anxious to show up any student of Boas's as uneducated. And of course he was ahistorical, and my dissertation study was as I conceived it, largely historical, just as much historical as it was comparison of art styles. So he sent me over to Perry, thinking that I would get entangled with Egyptians and pearl finders. Perry was an extraordinarily kind and nice man, and he gave me some instruction in physical anthropology. Meanwhile, of course, I've been reading all I could on fossil man. And I owe to Perry my introduction to Hallowell. Hallowell had sent him a copy of his dissertation, the bear cult in the Northern Hemisphere. And Perry gave that to me. You know, it ran through 4 numbers the entire year of the Anthropologist, and this was the off-print put together. And Perry gave that to me, saying, I think this will help you in what you're doing, because you're working in the North, the same kind of great distribution or potentialities of great distributions. I've been working out in the South. So that was a very great thing to have. Well, now, some of the changes that I've seen, obviously, as there came to be more people working in an area, and as I found in the Southwest, which was a much better studied area than any other that at the time. A lot had been done in archaeology. Kidder had published his Introduction to Southwestern Archaeology. I think it came out in 1924. There'd been all the people working on the Navajo and the Pueblo Indians. There was more room for depth, more need for depth of study, and that meant for more specialization. But that didn't mean that people didn't know, even though it wasn't your specialty, that you didn't know something about what others had done. So I really deplore now the breakup into all these hyphenated anthropologies, because I think we're losing something that we had in the past. Perhaps this is also true in large departments.
Well, you would consider like linguistic anthropology a hyphenated anthropology? Are you speaking about, or culture and personality as a hyphen? Just to make sure we're talking.
Well, wait a minute. There's economic anthropology for UC.
I see.
Or what are some of the titles of these divisions and so forth? Anthropology, symbolic anthropology. Well, now, good heavens, what is anthropology but symbolic, or largely dealing with symbols? It's that.
But you wouldn't consider terms like linguistic anthropology or anthropological or culture and personality is not what you're calling hyphenated anthropology?
Well, linguistic anthropology always was more specialized. It required, it seemed to me, a more specialized training or particular gifts. For someone without a good ear, it's pretty difficult to do good work, don't you think? Even though practically everybody under Boas, of the generation of students just before me, had brought back a grammar of one language or another. Now, how I escaped that, I don't know. But maybe, I remember Gladys Reichert had to write her grammar of Coeur d'Alene, you see. So people did their best, and it's better than nothing, and certainly better than the word lists that had found their way to one archive or another.
So you would say that the Boas tradition would definitely lead to this idea that you need training in all these areas.
Yes.
Because you're trying to describe the total culture, and language or archaeology or anything like that is just part of a total.
Yes. And furthermore, I still think one should have training in it, because as future teachers, aren't you likely to be teaching the introductory course? That was the first one I taught, and I kept at it for years. I wouldn't let anybody else teach it because I felt it was so important. It was a year's course, and it ranged from fossil man to all the way to most recent contacts with Indians and other people. Yes.
I see. Yeah. In that historic vein, too, something I think that would be of interest to students today would be, as a woman anthropologist and as a woman scholar and in the university as a field worker and so on, in all these aspects, can you look back and see changes in the role of women in anthropology and the university? And this has been so much of your life. And of course, you said your mother was a professor also,
yes.
So you have a lot of insight into the historical to the present of women in academia in general and specifically in anthropology.
Well, now remember, I was a graduate of Bryn Mawr College, and my parents both taught there. And Bryn Mawr College was founded by Quakers. It's not a Quaker institution, but it was founded by Quakers in order to provide a really good education for women, young women who might then become teachers of other young women, because the Quakers found most of their relaxation and companionship in family visits, visits of friends, in which the women played a very important part. So that if one was going to, the Quaker men and women turned to each other for intellectual stimulation in the home, so that the Quakers wanted educated women. So that was one of the reasons for the founding of Bryn Mawr. And the woman who was the second president, who had been dean before that, and who really molded Bryn Mawr College, was M. Carey Thomas, who was herself a militant feminist. And so there were a number of husband and wife teams teaching on the campus, and there had been, and she tried to get the best people she could. There were many young men who came as instructors, only to stay a few years and then get called on to other bigger places. So I had not had a feeling of intellectual inferiority because I was a woman, as I think a number of women have been made to feel.
I see.
Not at all. We were all in there together. I was aware, as a little girl, that women had a harder time than men, and I really was very sorry that I wasn't a boy, seeing the things that boys could do that I wanted to do. But then when it came, really, the chips were down. I was so lucky in my first field trip, you see, with Matthias, who treated me just as he would have treated a boy with him. And I asked him, what would you have done if I had not liked the food or hadn't enjoyed this? Oh, he just said, I would have sent you back to the village. He'd gone out on the next ship. So he always said that I was his most enthusiastic assistant. Well, now, that was a 6 months trip. And when I wrote back to my family, or I guess maybe I cabled them, send me $200. I have a chance to go to Greenland as an assistant to Matthias this coming summer. They'd never heard of him. They didn't know anything about him. And here their naive daughter, and I was naive, going off with this strange man. So they've telephoned Boas. Boas assured them that this was a really first-rate opportunity, and that Matthias was a great scholar. He was still pretty young, but foremost in his field. So I had this chance then of this experience, doing my own share of shoveling and all the rest of it, as we had to on this little small thing. Then in 1930, Burkett Smith wanted to come to the United States, dig in Alaska, but he got sick at the last moment. So I went ahead, as I've explained, taking my brother along as assistant. And after my brother went back to college opened, I chartered a gas boat on Cook Inlet at Anchorage and made the trip down Cook Inlet. I thought I was getting 2 men to run the boat, but it turned out only 1 man. The second one walked through the lobby of the hotel and saw me and decided he would not not sign on with me. So there were the 2 of us on this.
Because you were a woman.
Yeah. But Jack Fields, who owned the boat, became my most loyal supporter. And we visited all sorts of sites. Well, through him I found the important sites on Lower Cook Inlet, which established me professionally.
I see.
And Alaska in those days, you'd say, oh, well, not a place for a woman. But on the contrary, it was. if you're a lone woman among men, but pulling your own weight, you get any number of people to help you who are interested. So wherever I went, I made a point, of course, of asking, do they know anything about sites? So that anybody, or about this, that, or the other, asking archaeological and ethnological questions of anybody that I could pin down. So in that way, I got a lot of information.
Well, I sort of make a leap, maybe it'd be presumptuous, between your education at Bryn Mawr under militant feminism, preparing you to play that role you later played.
But I never was militant. You see, I never felt I had to fight for anything. No, and I'm not a fighter. That's just the other. I just took it for granted. And that does make a difference. Well, you see here, my archaeological and ethnological work was done not as a member of somebody else's team, except for that first season. I was a leader of expeditions, except for that one with Burkett Smith when we were co-leaders. But now it is difficult, very often, for young women to get a chance to go on an archaeological expedition with men. And if they go, their men want to put them to washing shirts or something like that. And they feel that the women will cramp their style. But I must say that at Bryn Mawr, we have not had that experience with since the department has grown, and we've had male archaeologists. The teaching of archaeology, American archaeology, and other areas was too much, you see, for one person. So as the department expanded, I was delighted to get more, to be able to add more people to the department. And they've taken women along. As far as I can tell, there's been no discrimination against what the women did or couldn't do.
Do you have any advice to young women, graduate students in anthropology, from your experiences?
If you care enough about it, you'll go ahead and do it. I don't know.
I see.
It's
I'd like to go back then
Yes.
to another topic that caught my ear, both because you mentioned the name Otto Kleinberg and because the period you were at Columbia, and it brings to mind the names Abram Gardner and Ralph Linton and that whole milieu that was dealing with maybe what we could call culture and personality area. Could you
no,
have
that was
experience?
later. No, that was later. I discovered that when I was teaching, but I don't remember quite how. In any case, it became a field in which I myself became very much interested, and I think that my interest came to be particularly sparked. Certainly, it was fed by relations with Hallowell. You see, the first kind of a job I got after I got my degree, or indeed while I was still working for my degree, was doing this archaeological work for the University of Pennsylvania Museum. And so it was through the museum and the meetings of the Philadelphia Anthropological Society that we all belonged to, that I came to know Mason, John Alden Mason. In fact, he was the head of the American section, so he was my boss. And then there was Hallowell, and he came. Actually, his wife, his second wife, Maud Hallowell, was a philosophy student of my mother's, or had been, and she knew Hallowell and realized that my mother would be interested in what he had to say. So I think it was my mother that made perhaps the first contact, but soon we became very intimate the four of us, and used to entertain each other for dinner and have long, interesting professional discussions. And but in any case, I did teach a course on culture and personality for quite a few years at Bryn Mawr College, more or less built up out of my own notion of what could go in it.
Do you consider that one of your subspecialties, the area of culture and
Yes,
personality?
yes, I do.
Have you any ideas about where that specialty is today and what you see is going on in culture and personality today, or not going on?
I would say that it perhaps isn't going on. Perhaps it's been deflected or absorbed in something else. I know Kroeber felt that it wasn't a real field, and his reason was that it had not developed a coherent theory of its own.
How do you feel about that? Is it a real field?
I don't know whether it still is. I think it was certainly at one time. Now, my interest in it was not so much on the influence of culture on personality. Mm-hmm. It was on how can one get a deeper understanding of culture via this approach, which, you see, I would use among others. You see, which is a little bit different in a slant.
Can you recall an example of how you did use it in your work, with this approach, to help you?
Oh, see, in my work? Well, I haven't really gotten around to the solid meat of it, and I hope I live long enough to do it. My biggest field work was done among the Tlingit of Yakutat. And I have material, some of it, quite a bit of it unpublished in notes, for one particular woman, our best informant. I say ours because during one whole season, Catherine McClellan and I worked together at Yakutat doing ethnographic work, while some young men who had, the young man, Fritz Riddell, who had been with me been with us at Angoon in 1950, were excavating at a site of the Yakutat people, so that we were doing both things together, and in a way I was in charge of both, although at long distance, and we did make trips out to their site, just as they made trips back to the village to bringing stuff to us. Well, anyway, I have material which would give an autobiographical material of particularly the early life of this Tlingit woman. And I think that not only is she interesting as a person, and that she was a wonderful storyteller, so I think the material will be fun to work with, put together. But I think through her and her own experiences, one gets a more intimate view of the culture than one could in any other way. Now, some of that has, some quotations from her have been utilized in my book, Under Mount St. Elias.
That's quite interesting. In other words, you see culture and personality, like these other quadrants, as aiding you in understanding the culture you're working on, not as something separate from it.
Yes, I think I do. I think that's correct.
Yes, that's quite interesting. Well, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think you'd like to talk about?
Let's see about are you still interested in Columbia in those days? I don't remember it all too well, but I do remember taking a course in with Gladys Reichert at Barnard in social organization. Boas himself didn't give it, and he told me I better go over there and take it, which I did. I found that course difficult. We used as a text Lowy's book, Social Organization, and I don't know whether you have looked at it recently. I had to look at it again, maybe about 10 years ago, when, or a little or longer ago than that, perhaps 12, 15 years ago, when Philip Kilbride, one of the men in our department at Bryn Mawr, and I gave a joint seminar, introductory seminar for graduate students on basic principles of anthropology. They'd come from so many different backgrounds, different places. We wanted to bring them together. And
take a drink of water for a second?
yes, I guess so. Is it all right? Going to turn this off?
No.
You can edit it out, eh?
Yeah.
Well, well, let's see. To go back to Lowy's primitive culture, primitive society, I mean, there hadn't been some of the systematic work done. So we didn't have as models all these different forms. At that time, of course, any kind of bilateral corporate organization wasn't understood at all. That really came later. Here was Boas dealing with it, but nobody was quite sure what it was. And certainly that wasn't fair at that time. Lowy had written this book partly as a challenge and answer to Morgan. You see, it was anti-evolutionary. Well, one reason why it was difficult, and difficult for me, was because there were illustrations drawn from a number of different cultures, different parts of the world, the Chukchi. Now, what did I know about the Chukchi? First, they were simply names. Then I discovered that most of them bred reindeer. Well, that's not enough. So I found that in order to understand this book, I had to take two kinds of notes. One on social organization only. The other on little cards, everything that was said about the Chukchi, and put them together. I think that is a problem in teaching. There is so much factual material which really has to be mastered. I know that now Ward Goodenough, whom I see fairly frequently at University of Pennsylvania, deplores the fact that there are not more people who are working in cross-cultural comparisons. In other words, they're just focused down on something, on some area, and I must confess that that's true of me now, but I feel that I can afford to do that at the present time. That's what I should be doing, so that they don't have enough wide background, enough pegs to hang theory on, and there's too much theory that is floating, generated by perhaps one field experience with one people or one group of people, and not checked against others.
Do you think, does Goodenough think that this is a permanent change in direction of the field of anthropology, or it's one of these?
Well, I should like to think that we're going through a phase, and that there'll be a kind of rediscovery, you know, and that we'll be coming back together. So
that it'll be one unified field?
Or more unified. No, I think there always is room for specialties. After all, in the old days when the annual meetings occupied only one room with one session, There would be a paper on folklore and a paper on physical anthropology. We got everything together. One of the most successful annual meetings was one organized, I think, by Joe Brew, but I'm not sure. There was a plenary session in which there was a paper from every possible field of anthropology that you could think of. And I went into that thinking, good heavens, what is this hodgepodge? But after a while, it began to dawn. This is anthropology. This is the real anthropology. Somehow or other, not made explicit, but implicit, there is a common basis of interest, of assumptions and understandings, and that all in some way are working towards the solution of exploring common problems. That was a thrilling experience,
now,
really.
in those days, too, would I be correct that you had one session at a time? I mean, there weren't 25?
No, there were several sessions then, so this was a plenary session, you see.
I see.
And when I was president and of the association, and Betty Meggers was program chairman, she asked me if there was anything particular I would like. And I told her about this and said that this is the kind of session that I would like.
I see.
And so that was what she arranged, and it was very interesting. She got some foremost people in different fields.
Well, it's been very pleasant talking to you. I've really enjoyed it, and we've been very fortunate to have this.
Well,
Yes?
Well, I've enjoyed talking too.
I've had a good time, and I think the students will learn a lot from listening to your conversation.
I hope so. It makes one remember things one had forgotten.
Maybe I hope that you'll write down some of the things too, and